Good evening, time traveler. Get comfortable, take a deep breath, and prepare for a journey into one of history's most dangerous urban environments. Tonight, we're going to experience what it was really like to survive on the streets of ancient Rome, the world's first megacity during its imperial peak from roughly 1st century BCE through 2nd century CE. But forget the images of gleaming marble temples, orderly citizens in togas, and the glory of empire. That's not our story tonight. Our journey takes us into the insulae, the cramped apartment buildings where most Romans lived, into the streets where chamber pots were emptied from upper windows, into the alleys controlled by gangs, and into a city where fire, collapse, disease, and violence were daily threats. This isn't the Rome of Hollywood epics with noble senators philosophizing in the forum. This is the reality. The overcrowded tenements that collapsed regularly, crushing inhabitants, the open sewers running through streets, the lead pipes poisoning the water supply, and the understanding that walking Rome streets after dark was essentially a death wish. Before we begin, leave me a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight. And if there's another historical topic you'd like me to explore, let me know. Your suggestions shape these journeys. Now, let's step into the cramped, filthy, dangerous streets of ancient Rome and discover what daily survival actually meant in history's greatest city. If you were an ordinary Roman living in the city during the 1st or 2nd century CE, you almost certainly lived in an insula, a multi-story apartment building, essentially the ancient equivalent of a tenement. Rome housed roughly 1 million people within its walls, making it the largest city in the ancient world and the first true megacity. The vast majority lived in insulae that rose 5, 6, or even 7 stories high, remarkable for pre-modern construction, but also terrifyingly dangerous. These buildings were cheaply constructed using brick and concrete, with wooden floors and minimal foundations. Landlords maximized profits by building as high as possible with as little material as they could get away with. Your apartment in an insula depended on your economic status, but even if you had money, the options were limited. The ground floor apartments were most desirable and expensive. They had direct street access, better light, and you didn't have to climb stairs. If you were a shopkeeper or craftsman, you might rent ground floor space that served as both workshop and residence. But most residents lived on upper floors. The higher you went, the cheaper the rent and worse the conditions. The top floors were cramped garrets under the roof where the poorest Romans lived, single rooms perhaps 10 by 10 feet, with no running water, no heating, minimal light, and no toilet facilities. The construction quality of insulae was notoriously poor. Building codes existed. Augustus limited building heights to 70 feet after repeated collapses, and later emperors reduced this further. But enforcement was lax, and landlords routinely violated regulation. The buildings were thrown up quickly using cheap materials. The foundations were often inadequate for the weight they supported. The upper floors extended over the lower ones, creating unstable overhangs. Wooden support beams were undersized. The whole structure creaked and swayed alarmingly in high winds. Residents lived with constant awareness that their building might collapse at any moment. And collapse they did, with horrifying regularity. The ancient sources mention building collapses casually, as routine occurrences. Entire insulae would suddenly collapse, killing everyone inside. Sometimes the collapse was triggered by heavy rain saturating the structure. Sometimes the foundations simply gave way under the weight. Sometimes, fire weakened the structure until it fell. The bodies would be pulled from the rubble, the site cleared, and a new insula built on the same spot, with the same cheap construction methods ready to collapse in its turn. If you lived in an insula, you went to sleep each night knowing that you might be crushed to death before morning. This wasn't paranoia, but rational assessment of risk. The fire danger was even worse than collapse risk. Insulae were built primarily of wood and had no modern fire safety features. Every apartment used open flames for cooking, heating, and light. Oil lamps, charcoal braziers, small cooking fires. One knocked-over lamp or errant spark could ignite an apartment, and fire spread rapidly through the wooden floors and walls. The buildings were packed close together, often sharing walls, so fire leapt from building to building. Rome had a fire brigade, the vigils established by Augustus, but their equipment was primitive and often ineffective. Water had to be carried in buckets or pumped manually. By the time the vigils arrived, fire had often spread too far to control. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, during Nero's reign, demonstrated the catastrophic potential. The fire burned for 6 days, destroying 10 of Rome's 14 districts. Hundreds of thousands were left homeless. The ancient sources describe people trapped in burning buildings, crushed in panicked crowds trying to escape, or dying from smoke inhalation. Nero was blamed, possibly unjustly, for starting the fire to clear space for his palace. But the reality is that Rome's construction made catastrophic fires inevitable. The city burned repeatedly throughout its history. Living in an insula meant accepting that fire might destroy everything you owned and kill you and your family at any time. The toilet situation in insula was disgusting and dangerous to health. If you lived on upper floors, your building had no plumbing. You used chamber pots that had to be emptied somewhere. The legal place to empty them was in the public sewers or cesspits, but the nearest might be several floors down and blocks away. Many residents simply threw their waste out the window into the street below. This was technically illegal, and you could be fined if caught, but enforcement was minimal and the practice was ubiquitous. The satirist Juvenal warned about walking under windows at night because of the risk of having chamber pots emptied on your head. Not just an unpleasant experience, but a genuine danger, since the ceramic pots themselves, thrown from upper floors, could kill you. The streets themselves were open sewers. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer, drained only some of the city, primarily the low-lying areas. Much of Rome lacked sewer access. Human and animal waste accumulated in the streets, mixing with garbage, dead animals, and the runoff from workshops, blood from butchers, toxic chemicals from fullers and dyers, animal waste from stables. During heavy rains, this toxic mixture flowed through the streets in torrents. In dry weather, it dried into a foul-smelling crust that was churned up by foot traffic and cartwheels, filling the air with clouds of fecal dust. The smell was overwhelming. Ancient sources describe Rome's characteristic stench that could be detected from miles away. The water supply was both Rome's greatest engineering achievement and a source of chronic poisoning. The aqueducts that brought water from distant hills were marvels of engineering, supplying hundreds of millions of gallons daily. But the distribution system within the city used lead pipes. The Romans knew lead was toxic. Pliny the Elder wrote about lead poisoning, but they used it anyway because it was malleable, durable, and cheaper than alternatives. The water flowing through lead pipes dissolved lead, especially in areas where water sat stagnant in pipes. Everyone who drank from public fountains or private connections was ingesting lead. The health effects were chronic and widespread. Cognitive impairment, reproductive problems, higher infant mortality, and reduced life expectancy. The noise level in Rome was unbearable by modern standards. The city had strict traffic restrictions. Wheeled vehicles were banned from the city center during daylight hours to reduce congestion. This meant all commercial transport happened at night. Starting at sunset, the streets filled with carts, wagons, and livestock being driven. The iron-rimmed wheels on stone pavement created deafening noise. Drivers shouted at each other and at pedestrians. Animals bellowed. The racket continued all night, making sleep difficult. The poet Martial complained that the noise of Rome made sleep impossible. Modern sound studies estimate nighttime noise levels in Rome reached 80-90 decibels, equivalent to heavy traffic or a lawnmower running constantly. The overcrowding was extreme. Rome at its peak housed roughly 1 million people in an area of about 5 square miles within the walls. Population density approached 50,000 people per square mile in some districts, comparable to modern Mumbai or Manila. The streets were narrow, often only 10-15 feet wide, constantly packed with people. You couldn't walk anywhere without being jostled by crowds. Pickpockets worked the crowds constantly. The press of bodies was claustrophobic. In narrow streets, when two groups met going opposite directions, one had to back up to let the other pass. The crowding facilitated disease transmission and created dangerous crush situations where people could be trampled. The crime rate was high and law enforcement was minimal. Rome had no police force in the modern sense. The vigils handled fires and some public order functions, but weren't primarily crime fighters. The urban cohorts were military units that suppressed riots, but didn't patrol streets preventing crime. If you were robbed or assaulted, your recourse was to bring private prosecution, which required resources most people lacked. The result was that criminals operated relatively freely, especially at night when the streets belonged to gangs. Walking alone after dark was dangerous. You risked being mugged, beaten, or killed. Even during the day, certain neighborhoods were controlled by gangs who extorted protection money from shopkeepers and residents. The violence in Rome was casual and frequent. Satirical writings describe men being assaulted randomly in streets by drunks or bored aristocrats looking for entertainment. The rich traveled with bodyguards, slaves trained to fight, but ordinary people had no protection. Street fights erupted over trivial disputes and could turn deadly. Bodies were found in the streets regularly. Murder victims, accident victims, or people who simply died of disease or exposure and were left where they fell. The authorities removed corpses when they became too numerous or too ripe, but otherwise, dead bodies in the street were unremarkable enough to not merit special comment. The food available to ordinary Romans was limited and often of poor quality. If you were poor, your diet consisted primarily of grain, wheat that you bought or received in the grain dole for citizens and made into porridge or cheap bread. You supplemented this with legumes, cheap vegetables like cabbage and onions, olive oil, and wine diluted with water. Fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal and often expensive. Meat was a luxury for most Romans, perhaps eaten at festivals or public distributions, but not daily. Fish sauce, garum, provided protein and flavor. The monotonous diet led to nutritional deficiencies. Scurvy from vitamin C deficiency was common. Anemia from iron deficiency was widespread. The bread itself was often adulterated. Bakers mixed chalk, sawdust, or other fillers into flour to increase profits. The public grain dole that provided free grain to Roman citizens was political necessity that kept the urban poor from rioting. But it wasn't generous. The monthly grain ration provided about 5 modi, roughly 33 kilograms of wheat, per citizen, enough for basic sustenance, but not abundance. You had to grind the grain yourself, or pay to have it ground, then bake it, or pay for baking. The grain wasn't always fresh. It might be years old, infested with weevils, or partially spoiled. But it prevented outright starvation and tied the urban poor to political leaders who maintained the dole. The famous phrase, bread and circuses, panem et circenses, described how Roman politicians kept the masses pacified through free grain and public entertainment. The public toilets in Rome were communal facilities without privacy or hygiene. The public latrines were large rooms with stone or wooden benches lining the walls. The benches had holes cut in them, spaced perhaps 18 inches apart. You sat shoulder to shoulder with other users, no partitions, having conversations while defecating. Beneath the seats, water channels flushed waste into sewers, or that was the theory. In practice, the water flow was often insufficient and waste accumulated. The Romans used sponges on sticks, spongia, dipped in vinegar or salt water to clean themselves, and these sponges were shared among users. The disease transmission from this arrangement was predictable and severe. The diseases that ravaged Rome were endemic and deadly. Malaria was constant presence in Rome. The marshes around the city bred mosquitoes that spread the disease. Fevers, probably malaria, affected large portions of the population seasonally. Gastrointestinal diseases, dysentery, typhoid, cholera, spread through contaminated water and food. Tuberculosis was widespread in the overcrowded, poorly ventilated insulae. Smallpox epidemics swept through the city periodically. The Antonine Plague, 165–180 CE, possibly smallpox or measles, killed millions across the empire, including in Rome. The Plague of Cyprian, 249–262 CE, was another devastating epidemic. Medicine was primitive. Physicians had limited understanding of disease causes, and treatments often did more harm than good. The medical care available to ordinary Romans was minimal and often dangerous. Physicians ranged from well-educated Greek doctors serving wealthy patients to charlatan peddlers of useless remedies. Surgery was performed without anesthesia or antiseptic technique. Amputations, bladder stone removal, cataract couching, with high mortality rates from infection and shock. Common treatments included bloodletting, purging, and toxic substances like mercury. The pharmacology was a mix of effective herbal remedies and complete nonsense. Magic and religion played large roles. People sought healing from temple incubation, prayers to gods, or amulets, and spells from magicians. Survival depended largely on your body's own ability to fight off disease. The infant and child mortality in Rome was horrific. Perhaps 30 to 40% of infants died before age 1. Roughly half of all children died before reaching adulthood. Malnutrition, disease, accidents, and simple neglect killed children constantly. Poor families sometimes exposed unwanted infants, leaving them in public places to die or be picked up by others because they couldn't afford to raise them. Girls were exposed more often than boys because they were considered less valuable. Wealthy families also lost many children, but had better nutrition and care that slightly improved survival odds. Childhood was dangerous period where death was expected outcome for many. The education available to ordinary Romans was minimal or non-existent. If you were poor, your children didn't attend school. They worked from early age, helping in workshops, running errands, or begging. Wealthy families hired private tutors to teach their sons and occasionally daughters reading, writing, mathematics, rhetoric, and Greek language and literature. The middle-class Romans might send sons to fee-charging schools where teachers taught basic literacy and numeracy. But the majority of Romans were illiterate and innumerate. They couldn't read public inscriptions, couldn't manage written accounts, and depended on literate scribes for any written communication. Illiteracy wasn't seen as major disadvantage in a primarily oral culture, but it limited economic and social opportunities. The slavery that permeated Roman society was everywhere visible on the streets. Rome had perhaps 300,000, 400,000 slaves in a population of 1 million. Roughly a third of the population was enslaved. Slaves performed every kind of labor: domestic service, construction, manufacturing, prostitution, entertainment, public administration. As free person in Rome, you encountered slaves constantly, carrying nobles' litters through streets, working in shops, cleaning public buildings, hauling goods. The slaves had no legal rights. They were property, not persons. Their treatment varied from relatively humane to horrifically abusive. The threat of being beaten, tortured, or killed kept slaves obedient. Escaped slaves were hunted, branded, and sometimes crucified as warnings. The presence of massive enslaved population created society where labor was devalued and violence was normalized. The gladiatorial games and public executions were mass entertainment that Romans attended eagerly. The Colosseum and other amphitheaters hosted combats where gladiators fought to death. Criminals were executed in elaborate staged spectacles, and exotic animals were slaughtered by the hundreds. These weren't occasional events, but frequent. Games might run for days, killing hundreds of people and thousands of animals. The crowds cheered the violence, betting on outcomes, demanding that wounded gladiators be killed rather than spared. The state used these spectacles as political tool, providing bread and circuses to keep the masses satisfied. The casual acceptance of death as entertainment reveals how violence-saturated Roman culture was. The public baths that served as social centers were also disease transmission vectors. Rome had hundreds of public baths, from small local establishments to massive imperial thermae, like the baths of Caracalla. For small fee, you could spend hours bathing, exercising, socializing. The baths had hot rooms, caldarium, warm rooms, tepidarium, and cold rooms, frigidarium. The water was heated by furnaces and wasn't changed frequently. Hundreds or thousands of people bathed in the same water. The result was bacterial and fungal soup that spread skin infections, eye diseases, and waterborne illnesses. But Romans valued bathing as civilized activity and social necessity, so people continued to use the baths despite health risks. The prostitution in Rome was ubiquitous and degrading. Brothels operated openly throughout the city, particularly in Suburra, the slum district. Prostitutes, mostly slaves or desperately poor free women, served customers in tiny cells barely large enough for a narrow bed. The walls of Pompeii's brothels preserve erotic frescoes and graffiti from customers. Street prostitutes solicited in alleys and doorways. The pricing was low. A prostitute might charge 1 or 2 asses, small copper coins, for basic service, roughly the price of a loaf of bread. The work was dangerous. Disease, violence from customers, exploitation by pimps. Male prostitutes also worked the streets, serving the homosexual market that Roman culture recognized but officially condemned. Prostitution was legal and taxed, but socially degrading. Prostitutes had no legal protection and minimal social status. The taverns and popinae, cheap eating establishments that dotted Rome's streets, were social gathering places, but also centers of vice. These establishments served cheap food, wine, and sometimes provided gambling and prostitution. They were frequented by the lower classes, laborers, slaves on errands, petty criminals. The wine was often adulterated with water, resin, or worse substances. Fights erupted regularly. Thieves worked the crowds. But for poor Romans living in tiny apartments with no cooking facilities, the popinae provided hot food and social life that their insulae lacked. The authorities viewed taverns with suspicion as potential centers of political organization and occasionally cracked down on them, but they were too numerous and too important to working-class life to suppress completely. The weather in Rome created additional hardships. Summers were hot and humid. Temperatures regularly exceeded 90 degrees, 32 in the packed insulae with no air conditioning and minimal ventilation. The heat was oppressive. People slept on rooftops or in the streets to escape the stifling apartments. Winters were cold and damp. Temperatures often dropped below freezing at night. The insulae had no central heating. Your only warmth came from charcoal braziers that filled rooms with smoke and carbon monoxide, creating constant respiratory problems and occasional deaths from carbon monoxide poisoning. Rain turned the unpaved streets into muddy rivers. The seasonal variations meant constant discomfort. Too hot in summer, too cold in winter, and wet and muddy in the rainy seasons. The street performers and beggars who populated Rome's streets created constant spectacle. Buskers performed music, acrobatics, juggling, or simple begging. Fortune-tellers offered prophecies. Quack doctors sold miraculous cures. Beggars, many disabled from accidents, disease, or deliberate mutilation, pleaded for alms. Street preachers for various cults and philosophies competed for attention and converts. The noise, visual chaos, and constant solicitation was overwhelming. For visitors from smaller cities or rural areas, Rome's streets were assault on senses. Too many people, too much noise, too many smells, too much happening simultaneously to process. The festivals and holidays that punctuated the Roman calendar provided entertainment and occasional food distributions, but also created dangerous crowding. Rome had numerous festival days, religious ceremonies, public games, triumphal processions. These drew massive crowds into limited spaces. Crush injuries and deaths occurred when crowds panicked or surged. The authorities tried to manage crowds through barriers and troop presence, but accidents happened regularly. The festivals also provided opportunities for pickpockets, cut purses, and other criminals to work the distracted crowds. Despite the dangers, festivals were important breaks from grinding poverty and labor, offering free entertainment and sometimes free food or money distributions. The garbage in Rome's streets was a constant problem without good solution. There was no organized garbage collection for most of the city. People threw waste into the streets. Food scraps, broken pottery, ashes from fires, dead animals, human waste. Some streets had large containers where garbage was supposed to be deposited, but these were often overflowing. Scavengers, including pigs allowed to roam the streets, consumed some organic waste. The rain washed some garbage into sewers or the Tiber River, but much simply accumulated, especially in poor neighborhoods where enforcement of any sanitation rules was minimal. Walking Rome streets meant navigating through and around piles of garbage in various stages of decay. The traffic jams in Rome were legendary despite the daytime ban on wheeled vehicles. Pedestrian traffic alone created congestion. Litters carrying wealthy Romans required space and right-of-way that pedestrians had to yield. Livestock being driven to market-filled streets. The occasional imperial procession paralyzed entire districts as troops cleared streets and crowds gathered to watch. The narrow streets meant that any obstruction, a collapsed building, a broken-down car, a fight, created backups that could last hours. Romans learned to avoid certain routes at certain times, but sometimes navigation through the crowded streets was simply impossible, and you waited or found a roundabout route that might double your travel. The neighborhoods of Rome varied dramatically in character and safety. The Palatine Hill was where emperors built palaces, off limits to ordinary people. The Forum area housed government buildings, major temples, and markets, crowded but relatively safe during the day. Subura was notorious slum district, cramped buildings, narrow alleys, high crime, prostitution, and poverty. The Trastevere district across the Tiber was populated by immigrants, workers, and foreign communities, more diverse and less controlled than central Rome. Aventine Hill was working-class district with mix of warehouses, insulae, and small temples. Knowing which neighborhoods to avoid and which routes were relatively safe was essential survival knowledge. The Tiber River that flowed through Rome was both asset and hazard. The river provided water for industries, transportation for goods, and defined boundaries between districts. But it was also open sewer. Waste from the Cloaca Maxima and other drains emptied into it, as did bodies of executed criminals, slaves, and unclaimed dead. The river flooded regularly, inundating low-lying areas with foul water that destroyed property and spread disease. The flooding was unpredictable. Heavy rainfall upstream could cause sudden floods that gave little warning. Buildings near the river were cheaper because of flood risk, so poor people lived in the most vulnerable areas. After floods, the mud left behind was contaminated with sewage and required weeks to dry and be cleared. The markets in Rome offered extraordinary variety of goods from across the empire, exotic foods, spices, fabrics, craftwork, animals. But prices were high for ordinary items, and cheap goods were often fraudulent. Market regulation existed, but enforcement was spotty. Merchants adulterated foods, used false weights, and sold spoiled goods disguised with spices or dyes. Buyers had to be constantly vigilant against fraud. The poor shopped at the worst stalls, selling the lowest quality goods at prices they could barely afford. The price fluctuations based on harvest quality, shipping disruptions, or political instability meant that staple goods might suddenly become unaffordable, creating food crises that led to riots. The bread riots that occurred periodically in Rome when grain supplies were disrupted demonstrated the political volatility of the imported vast quantities of grain from Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily. Disruptions to shipping, storms, piracy, political conflicts could create shortages that drove prices up. When bread became too expensive or unavailable, riots erupted. The crowds attacked bakers, grain dealers, and sometimes imperial property. The authorities responded with force. Troops dispersed crowds, ringleaders were executed. But the emperors also knew they had to maintain grain supplies and reasonable prices or face mass unrest. The entire political system depended on keeping the urban poor fed enough to prevent rebellion. The animals in Rome's streets created constant hazards. Dogs roamed in packs, some feral, some semi-owned. They scavenged garbage, attacked strangers, and spread rabies. Rats were everywhere, in buildings, sewers, and streets, spreading disease through their waste and parasite. Livestock being driven to market, cattle, pigs, sheep, created traffic problems and sometimes trampled people. Horses pulling carts and litters kicked or bit pedestrians who got too close. Exotic animals for games escaped occasionally, creating panic. Imagine a panicked leopard or bear loose in crowded streets. Animal waste added to the filth in streets. The presence of so many animals in dense urban environment created sanitation and safety problems that Rome never adequately solved. The building regulations that theoretically controlled construction were routinely violated. Augustus's height limit of 70 feet was ignored by developers who bribed inspectors or simply built and hoped they wouldn't be caught. The requirement that buildings leave space between them for fire prevention was violated to maximize rental income. The building codes that specified foundation depths and wall thicknesses were treated as suggestions. When buildings collapsed, authorities might impose fines or punish builders, but the financial incentives to cut corners were too strong. The result was that insulae remained dangerously constructed despite centuries of collapses and fires that should have prompted better regulation and enforcement. The chariot racing that Romans obsessed over wasn't just entertainment, but source of factional violence. The four racing factions, reds, blues, greens, and whites, had passionate supporters who sometimes rioted over race outcomes. The circus factions became political forces, especially the blues and greens. Emperor Justinian faced the Nika riots in 532 CE in Constantinople. But the factional tensions existed in Rome too, that nearly overthrew him. In Rome, faction supporters wore their colors, gathered in specific taverns, and sometimes fought in the streets. The circus provided outlet for political and social tensions, but also created new sources of violence. If you wore the wrong faction's colors in the wrong neighborhood, you risked being attacked. The insularii, the landlords who owned insulae, were among Rome's most despised figures. They maximized profits through cheap construction, minimal maintenance, overcrowding, and aggressive rent collection. They evicted tenants who couldn't pay, sometimes hiring thugs to forcibly remove residents and their possessions. Some insularii were wealthy equestrians, or even senators who viewed rental properties as investments to be exploited. Others were freedmen who'd accumulated capital and bought properties. Regardless of their background, landlords' interests were opposed to tenants. Every cost reduction, every rent increase enriched landlords while making tenants' lives worse. The hatred of landlords was visceral and occasionally erupted into violence when tenants destroyed property or attacked rent collectors. The legal system that theoretically protected Romans was in practice accessible mainly to the wealthy. Going to court required time, money, and connections. You needed to hire advocates, lawyers, gather evidence and witnesses, and navigate complex procedures. For poor Romans, legal recourse was essentially unavailable. Small disputes over debts, property damage, or personal injuries were settled through informal mediation, private vengeance, or simply endured. Major crimes like murder might be prosecuted, but even then, the outcome depended on the victim's social status and the accused's wealth and connections. The law formally recognized rights and procedures, but the practice was that justice was for those who could afford it. The urban cohorts and Praetorian Guard who supposedly maintained order were often sources of disorder themselves. The soldiers supplemented their pay by extorting protection money from shopkeepers, stealing from civilians, and sometimes engaging in outright violence for entertainment. The Praetorians, elite troops stationed in Rome, considered themselves above the law and acted accordingly. They drunk in taverns and started fights, harassed women, and occasionally rioted when they felt their pay or privileges were threatened. Several emperors were overthrown or murdered by their own Praetorian guards. The military presence that was supposed to make Rome safer often made it more dangerous. The cults and religions that competed in Rome's streets reflected the empire's diversity, but also created tensions. Traditional Roman religion, with its pantheon of gods and state rituals, coexisted with mystery cults from the East, Isis, Cybele, Mithras, and eventually Christianity and other monotheisms. Each cult had temples, processions, festivals, and adherents. Conflicts between cults occasionally led to violence. Christian churches attacked pagan temples. Pagan mobs attacked Christians. Jews and Christians clashed. The religious diversity enriched Rome's culture, but also created another source of social division and conflict. The Jews in Rome lived primarily in Trastevere and maintained distinct identity while integrating into urban life. The Jewish community numbered perhaps 40,000 to 50,000 at its peak. They had synagogues, kept kosher dietary laws, observed Sabbath, and maintained cultural practices that distinguished them from Gentiles. The relationship between Jews and Roman authorities varied. Some emperors protected Jews, others oppressed them. The destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 CE brought influx of Jewish captives sold into slavery. Popular attitudes toward Jews ranged from tolerance to hostility. Jews faced occasional violence from mobs and discriminatory treatment, but also successfully operated businesses, held citizenship, and participated in Roman economic life. The Christians in Rome were persecuted intermittently, but grew steadily from the 1st century CE. Early Christians met secretly in homes and catacombs to avoid detection. The persecution under Nero, 64 CE, after the Great Fire, set precedent for blaming Christians for disasters. Subsequent emperors persecuted Christians sporadically. Domitian, Decius, Diocletian all launched campaigns against Christians. Christians were executed in the amphitheater as entertainment, thrown to wild animals, burned alive, crucified. But persecution was inconsistent, and Christianity continued to spread, particularly among urban poor and slaves who found its message of salvation and community appealing. By the 4th century, Christianity would become the empire's official religion. But during the 1st, 3rd centuries, being Christian in Rome meant risking death. The foreign communities in Rome, Greeks, Egyptians, Syrians, Jews, Gauls, Germans, Africans, created cosmopolitan city, but also ethnic tensions. Each community tended to cluster in specific neighborhoods, maintain native languages and customs, and compete for economic niches. The Greeks dominated education and medicine. Syrians were prominent in trade. Germans served in military units. Egyptians worked as sailors and dock workers. These communities enriched Rome's culture, but also created resentments when natives felt foreigners were taking jobs or resources. Ethnic violence occasionally erupted. Attacks on foreigners' shops, fights between ethnic groups, or scapegoating during crises. A specific example of the 64 CE Great Fire and its aftermath illustrates how disasters affected ordinary Romans. The fire destroyed vast swaths of the city, leaving hundreds of thousands homeless. Nero opened public buildings and gardens to house refugees and organized food distributions. But then he used the cleared land to build his massive Golden Palace, a complex covering perhaps 100 acres of prime urban land that could have housed thousands. The residents whose insulae burned had to relocate to other overcrowded neighborhoods or leave the city. The building boom that followed the fire created jobs, but also inflation that made housing even less affordable. Nero's persecution of Christians as scapegoats created a climate of fear. The fire and its consequences showed how urban disasters affected the poor most severely. The life expectancy for Romans was roughly 25-30 years at birth, though this figure is deceptive. Infant and child mortality pulled the average down dramatically. If you survived to age 10, you might live to 50 or 60. But urban life reduced life expectancy. The diseases, violence, and accidents in Rome killed people at higher rates than in rural areas. The comparison between rich and poor life expectancies is difficult to calculate precisely, but the wealthy certainly lived longer on average. They had better nutrition, cleaner housing, access to medical care, and were less exposed to violence and dangerous working conditions. But even wealthy Romans died young by modern standards. Emperors, senators, and aristocrats succumbed to diseases and injuries that modern medicine prevents or treats easily. The workday for ordinary Romans began at dawn and lasted until sunset, with midday break during hottest hours. If you were laborer, artisan, or shopkeeper, you worked 6 days a week. Markets were closed every 8 days, the Roman week equivalent. The work was physical and exhausting. Construction workers hauled materials and operated tools manually. Bakers kneaded dough by hand and tended hot ovens. Fullers trampled clothes in vats of urine to clean them. Tanners worked with toxic chemicals. Porters carried heavy loads through crowded streets. Workplace accidents were common and usually meant permanent disability or death, since there was no workers' compensation or disability support. You worked until you couldn't, then depended on family or charity, or simply died. The women in Rome's street faced specific dangers and constraints. Respectable women, those from citizen families, were expected to stay home or travel with escort. Going out alone risked being mistaken for a prostitute or being sexually harassed or assaulted. Women doing marketing or visiting baths or attending religious festivals had to navigate streets where men felt entitled to comment, touch, or proposition them. Poor women who had to work as servants, laundresses, spinners, vendors were even more vulnerable because their lower social status meant less protection. Sexual violence against slave women was routine and unpunished, since slaves had no legal right to refuse sexual access. Being female in Rome's streets meant constant vigilance and vulnerability. The children in Rome's streets were everywhere, working, begging, playing, getting into trouble. Poor children worked from age 5, 6, helping parents in workshops, running errands, selling goods in markets, or begging. Child labor wasn't just accepted, but expected. Families needed children's contributions to survive. Street children, orphans, or abandoned by families that couldn't support them, survived through begging, theft, prostitution, or being taken in by criminal gangs. The exploitation of children was pervasive and unremarkable. Some children were bought or kidnapped and deliberately maimed to make them more effective beggars. A crippled child elicited more pity and donations. Childhood for the urban poor was harsh and often short. The elderly who survived to old age faced neglect and poverty unless they had family or wealth to support them. Roman culture respected age in theory. Elders were supposed to be honored, but the economic reality was brutal. If you couldn't work and had no savings or family, you depended on charity or starved. The grain dole helped elderly citizens survive but didn't provide comfort. Old age meant chronic pain from arthritis and injuries, failing eyesight and hearing, tooth loss, and general physical decline without effective medical treatment. Many elderly ended up begging in the streets, selling whatever small possessions they had, or living in degrading dependence on reluctant relatives. The philosophical acceptance of suicide as rational choice was partly influenced by the reality that prolonged old age without resources was misery. The fullers and tanners whose workshops polluted neighborhoods exemplified how industrial processes created health hazards. Fullers cleaned and processed cloth using human and animal urine. They collected it from public urinals and used it to clean fabric. The smell was nauseating, and the chemicals caused respiratory and skin problems. Tanners processed leather using animal waste, urine, and toxic minerals. The stench from tanneries was overwhelming, and the workers developed chronic health problems from chemical exposure. These industries were essential, but no one wanted them nearby. So they concentrated in poor neighborhoods where residents lacked power to object. Living near these workshops meant constant exposure to toxic fumes and water pollution. The crucifixions that Romans used as punishment and deterrent were common sights on roads leading into and out of the city. Crucifixion was death penalty reserved primarily for slaves, non-citizens, and political enemies. The victim was scourged, forced to carry the crossbeam to the execution site, then nailed or tied to the cross and left to die slowly, sometimes taking days. The body was often left on the cross to rot as warning. Major slave rebellions resulted in mass crucifixions. After Spartacus's revolt was suppressed in 71 BCE, 6,000 captured slaves were crucified along the Appian Way from Capua to Rome. The sight of decaying bodies on crosses was meant to terrorize and intimidate. Travelers entering Rome past these grim displays reminded of Roman power and the fate of those who challenged it. The arena spectacles that entertained Romans required massive infrastructure and resources. The Colosseum could hold 50,000. Filling it required organizing transport for crowds, maintaining order during events, and providing the games themselves. Procuring gladiators, wild animals, criminals for execution, elaborate stage sets. The animals came from across the empire, lions from Africa, bears from Europe, elephants from Asia. Thousands of animals were slaughtered for single games. The exotic animal trade depleted wildlife populations across the Mediterranean. The gladiators were slaves, prisoners of war, or desperate volunteers. The famous gladiators who survived many fights were celebrities, but most died quickly in the arena. The massive entertainment complex required for these spectacles represented enormous diversion of resources to providing violent entertainment for the masses. The housing shortage in Rome meant that landlords could charge high rents for terrible accommodations and still fill their buildings. The economic pressure was relentless. Rents consumed perhaps 20–40% of working-class income, leaving minimal margin for food and other necessities. If you lost your job or fell ill and couldn't pay rent, you were evicted with no legal protection. The constant insecurity about housing created chronic stress. Moving to a different apartment meant finding one that was available and affordable, which was difficult given demand. Many people stayed in inadequate or dangerous housing simply because they had nowhere else to go. The landlords knew this and exploited it ruthlessly. The comparison between life in Rome and in smaller cities or rural areas reveals that Rome's size created unique problems. Smaller cities had many similar issues: poor sanitation, disease, crime, but less severely. Rome's density magnified every problem. The infrastructure couldn't keep pace with population growth. The social anonymity of a megacity reduced community cohesion and informal social controls that worked in smaller communities. The concentration of wealth and poverty in close proximity created tensions. Rome was spectacular and horrifying simultaneously. The monuments, the diversity, the opportunities attracted people across the empire, but the daily reality for most residents was grinding poverty, danger, and discomfort. The imperial cult that deified emperors and demanded public worship created another layer of social obligation and potential danger. Refusing to participate in imperial cult rituals could be interpreted as disloyalty or treason. Jews and Christians who refused to sacrifice to the emperor faced persecution. The cult wasn't just religious but political, demonstrating loyalty to the empire and emperor through ritual acts. For ordinary Romans, participating in imperial cult ceremonies was civic duty, not necessarily sincere religious belief. But the requirement to publicly demonstrate loyalty through religious acts created problems for those whose actual religious beliefs forbade it. The wealth disparity in Rome was extreme. Senators had minimum property qualification of 1 million sesterces, vast fortunes that most Romans couldn't imagine. A day laborer might earn 3–4 sesterces daily. A modestly successful craftsman might accumulate 20,000–50,000 sesterces over a lifetime. The gap between the richest and poorest was enormous, and there was relatively little middle class by modern standards. This inequality was visible everywhere. Wealthy Romans in litters carried by slaves passed beggars in the streets. Grand villas overlooked insulae. The expensive goods in luxury markets contrasted with cheap merchandise in poor districts. The wealthy consumed vast resources while the poor struggled to survive. The inequality created resentments, but also seemed natural and inevitable in a society that accepted hierarchy as divinely ordained. The entertainment available to ordinary Romans beyond the games included theaters, musical performances, street entertainers, and tavern socializing. Theaters presented comedies and tragedies, though these were less popular than the violent spectacles of the arena. Musicians and dancers performed in public spaces and private gatherings. The popinae and taverns provided social spaces where people drank, gambled, talked, and sometimes watched performers. Sexual entertainment was readily available and socially acceptable for men. The public baths combined bathing, exercise, and socializing. Despite the hardships of daily life, Romans had access to entertainment and leisure activities that provided some relief from grinding poverty and labor. The literacy and numeracy levels in Rome meant that written culture was accessible only to a minority. Perhaps 10 to 20% of Romans could read beyond basic level. Writing was taught to even smaller percent. Most business was conducted orally or with assistance from scribes. The graffiti preserved at Pompeii shows that some ordinary people could write basic messages, but the sophisticated literary culture, poetry, rhetoric, philosophy, was elite preserve. For the illiterate majority, information and culture were transmitted orally through speeches, storytelling, theater, and conversation. The reliance on oral culture meant that news spread through word of mouth, often distorted or exaggerated, and that most Romans' knowledge of the wider world was limited and often inaccurate. The veterans who settled in Rome after military service theoretically had better prospects than other poor Romans. They'd received discharge bonuses and sometimes land grants. But many veterans squandered their bonuses, found civilian life difficult after military discipline, and ended up poor in the city. The veteran communities provided some mutual support, but the transition from military to civilian life was often troubled. Some veterans joined the vigils or urban cohorts, continuing in security roles. Others used their literacy and discipline to become clerks or administrators, but many simply disappeared into the mass of urban poor, their military service providing little long-term benefit. The food preservation techniques available to Romans, salting, smoking, drying, and fermenting, allowed some foods to be stored, but created monotonous diet. Salted fish and meat were staples, but were harsh on digestive systems and required large amounts of water to process. Dried fruits and vegetables lost nutrients and texture. Fermented fish sauce, garum, was flavoring staple, but was made from fermented fish guts and smelled terrible during production. Fresh foods were seasonal and often expensive. The lack of refrigeration meant that in summer, food spoiled quickly, and eating it risked food poisoning. The diet's limitations contributed to nutritional deficiencies that affected health and longevity. The future that ordinary Romans could envision for themselves and their children was constrained by social mobility's near impossibility. If you were born poor, you almost certainly died poor. Social advancement required extraordinary luck, talent, or unscrupulous willingness to exploit others. Freedmen, former slaves who'd been freed, sometimes accumulated wealth through business, but they faced social discrimination and legal restrictions. The sons of freedmen had better prospects, and their grandsons might be accepted as respectable citizens. But this represented generational mobility at best. For the vast majority, their children would do the same work, live in the same neighborhoods, and face the same hardships they did. The lack of social mobility created resignation and acceptance of poverty as permanent condition. The astrologers and fortune tellers who offered predictions and advice were ubiquitous, despite official disapproval. Romans at all social levels consulted astrologers about major decisions, business ventures, health, and personal relationships. The belief that fate was determined by celestial forces was widely accepted. Fortune tellers, using various divination methods, examining animal entrails, interpreting dreams, reading omens, offered their services in markets and street corners. Some were sincere believers in their methods, others were charlatans exploiting credulity. The authorities periodically expelled astrologers from Rome because their predictions could be politically destabilizing, but they always returned because demand was insatiable. The public executions that occurred in the arena and other locations served as entertainment and political messaging. Criminals were executed creatively, burned alive, thrown to wild animals, forced to fight as poorly armed gladiators against professionals, or crucified. The executions were sometimes staged as mythological reenactments, criminals playing Prometheus, having their livers eaten by eagles, or playing Orpheus being torn apart by animals. The elaborate creativity in killing people demonstrates both Roman appetite for violence and the state's use of spectacular death as deterrent and demonstration of power. The crowds cheered the executions, apparently unmoved by the suffering they were watching. The casual acceptance of torture and death as entertainment reveals the profound differences between Roman and modern moral sensibilities. The archaeological evidence from Pompeii and Herculaneum, cities buried by Vesuvius in 79 CE, provides detailed picture of daily life that confirms and elaborates on literary sources. The preserved buildings show the cramped upper-floor apartments, the shop fronts that opened to streets, the graffiti that covered walls, advertisements, insults, love declarations, political slogans. The carbonized food remains show what people actually ate. The skeletons reveal diseases, injuries, and nutritional deficiency. The household objects show the simple material culture of ordinary people. Pompeii wasn't Rome. It was much smaller and more prosperous, but it provides tangible evidence of urban life that helps us understand what Rome's streets were like. The transformation of Rome from republic to empire changed political life, but not daily living conditions for the poor. The end of republican government meant ordinary citizens no longer voted in meaningful elections, but they'd been politically marginalized long before. The emperors maintained the grain dole, provided public entertainment, and kept order. The basic bargain of bread and circuses. For ordinary Romans, imperial rule was tolerable as long as grain kept flowing and the city remained stable. The political upheavals when emperors were overthrown or civil wars erupted disrupted commerce and created insecurity, but didn't fundamentally change how poor Romans lived. The concentration of power in the emperor actually provided clearer authority structure than the factional politics of the late Republic. The decline of Rome in the 3rd century CE brought increased hardships. The crisis of the 3rd century, 235–284 CE, saw a rapid succession of emperors, civil wars, barbarian invasions, economic disruption, and plague. The population of Rome declined, though it remained the largest western city. The disruption to grain supplies caused famines. The debasement of coinage created inflation that made everyone poorer. The plague epidemics killed large percentages of the population. The city walls built by Aurelian, 270–275 CE, reflected defensive concerns unknown during the empire's peak. For ordinary Romans living through this period, the glory of Rome was fading, and survival became even more difficult than during better times. The later empire saw a gradual depopulation of Rome as the economic and political center shifted east to Constantinople. By the 5th century CE, Rome's population had declined to perhaps 500,000, 600,000. Still a large city, the insulae remained, the streets remained, but with less crowding and commerce. The barbarian Sacs, Visigoths in 410 CE, Vandals in 455 CE, disrupted the city and carried off wealth, but didn't destroy it. The final end of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE was almost anticlimactic for ordinary Rome. The city had been declining for generations. Medieval Rome would be a much smaller city with population perhaps 30,000, 40,000, a shadow of its former greatness, but also a relief from the overcrowding and dangers of the imperial megacity. The question of whether life improved for ordinary people as Rome declined is complicated. The reduced population meant less crowding, lower rents, and less competition for resources, but it also meant reduced commerce, fewer opportunities, and greater insecurity as central authority weakened. The comparison suggests that Rome's size and glory came at terrible cost to ordinary people, but its decline brought different problems rather than solutions. The medieval Romans lived in crumbling ruins of ancient buildings, using the Forum as cattle pasture, oblivious to or indifferent to the grandeur that had once existed. The hardships they faced were different from, but not necessarily less than, imperial Rome's. The modern archaeological and historical understanding of Rome has been transformed by scientific methods. Skeletal analysis reveals diseases, diet, injuries, and life expectancy. Lead isotope analysis shows the extent of lead poisoning from pipes. DNA analysis shows population origins and disease transmission. Coprolite analysis shows what people actually ate and what parasites infected them. Ground-penetrating radar and remote sensing reveal structures without excavation. The combination of literary sources, inscriptions, archaeological remains, and scientific analysis creates an increasingly detailed picture of daily life in ancient Rome. The evidence consistently shows that while Roman engineering and organization were impressive, the actual living conditions for ordinary people were harsh by any standard. The comparison between Rome and other ancient cities, Athens, Alexandria, Carthage, Chang'an, reveals that Rome's problems weren't unique to Roman civilization, but common to ancient urbanism. Large pre-modern cities all struggled with sanitation, disease, fire, crime, and social inequality. Rome's scale made it exceptional. It was larger than any other Western city would be until London in the 18th century, but the fundamental problems were universal. The lack of germ theory, absence of modern medicine, primitive building materials, limited transportation technology, and exploitative social structures created conditions where urban life was dangerous and uncomfortable, regardless of which civilization built the city. The lessons from Rome about urbanism include that density without adequate infrastructure creates health and safety hazards, that inequality creates social tensions and instability, that providing basic services, food, water, sanitation, security, is essential for urban viability, and that even impressive civilizations often fail to provide decent living conditions for majority of their citizens. Rome's engineering achievements, aqueducts, roads, concrete construction, were genuine marvels, but they served a system that accepted poverty, slavery, inequality, and mass suffering as natural and inevitable. Understanding Rome honestly requires appreciating both the achievements and the brutal costs they were built upon. The romanticization of Rome that persists in Western culture reflects selective memory and idealization. The neoclassical architecture, the fascination with Roman law and governance, the admiration for Roman military achievements, the cultural influence of Latin literature, these represent Rome's legacy to Western civilization. But this cultural heritage obscures the reality that Rome was society built on slavery, maintained through violence, and characterized by extreme inequality, where most people lived in conditions of grinding poverty and constant danger. The marble monuments that inspire awe were built by enslaved labor and paid for by exploiting conquered peoples. The glory of Rome rested on foundations of suffering. The question of whether ordinary Romans knew how bad their conditions were compared to alternatives is unanswerable but interesting. They didn't have statistics on life expectancy, disease rates, or comparative living standards. They knew from travelers' accounts and veteran stories that other places existed with different conditions, but information was limited and often inaccurate. The philosophical acceptance of fate, the religious explanations for suffering, and the social conditioning to accept hierarchy meant that many Romans probably didn't imagine that life could be fundamentally different. They endured their conditions because endurance was the only option, not because they consciously chose the urban Roman life over alternatives they understood. The individual experiences that statistics and generalization obscure are irrecoverable in detail, but imaginable in outline. The woman who gave birth in a cramped insula apartment with only a neighbor for help, losing her life to infection days later. The child who fell from an upper-story window while playing and died in the street. The man crushed when his building collapsed during a storm. The slave woman raped by her owner who had no legal recourse. The worker injured in an accident who slowly starved because he couldn't work. The elderly man who froze to death during a cold winter night. These individual tragedies, multiplied millions of times over centuries, created Rome's human reality behind the impressive statistics of population and monuments. The ultimate assessment of what it meant to survive Rome's streets is that it required constant vigilance, acceptance of danger and discomfort, luck to avoid the numerous ways the city could kill you, and resilience to endure conditions that modern people would find intolerable. You survived by knowing which neighborhoods to avoid, which wells had less contaminated water, how to navigate crowds without being robbed, how to dodge falling debris and chamber pots, how to earn enough for rent and food without being cheated or exploited worse than was inevitable. You survived by accepting that fire might destroy everything you owned, that disease might kill your children, that violence might end your life randomly. You survived by being tough, cunning, and lucky. And many people weren't lucky enough to survive. The comparison between surviving Rome's streets and surviving in modern cities reveals how much living conditions have improved. Modern cities have problems: crime, pollution, inequality, housing costs. But the fundamental dangers of ancient Rome are absent. Buildings don't routinely collapse. Fire doesn't destroy entire neighborhoods. Diseases that killed millions are prevented by vaccination or treated with antibiotics. Water is clean. Sanitation is functional. The rule of law provides some protection even if imperfectly applied. The material conditions of modern urban life, even for the poor, exceed what ancient Rome's wealthy experienced in many respects. Understanding this transformation helps us appreciate modernity's achievements while remaining critical of its failings. So the next time you see a movie about ancient Rome, the gleaming marble, the heroic gladiators, the wise senators, remember the reality. The insulae that collapsed regularly, crushing inhabitants, the chamber pots emptied from upper windows onto pedestrians below, the open sewers running through streets, the lead poisoning from water pipes affecting everyone who drank, the fires that destroyed neighborhoods, the diseases that killed children at rates of 30–40%, the gangs that controlled streets after dark, and the understanding that even the wealthy Romans lived in conditions modern middle-class people would find intolerable. Remember that Rome's grandeur was built on foundations of slavery, violence, and exploitation, and that the glory we admire was accompanied by mass suffering we conveniently forget. Surviving Rome's streets wasn't the romantic adventure of Hollywood, but a daily struggle against dangers that could kill you at any moment. Your building might collapse, fire might destroy everything you owned, disease might kill your family, violence might end your life, or simple poverty might slowly grind you down until you had nothing left. The few who thrived did so by exploiting others. The many who barely survived did so through luck, toughness, and acceptance of hardships that modern people can barely imagine. The city was spectacular and horrifying simultaneously, a testament to human achievement built upon human suffering. And so ends our journey through Rome's streets. If you enjoyed this exploration of reality behind the marble monuments and imperial glory, subscribe for more journeys revealing historical truths. Leave a comment telling me which aspect of Roman street life surprised you most, or suggest another topic you'd like me to explore. Sleep well, time traveler, and maybe tonight, appreciate that your building has fire exits and building codes that are actually enforced, that your water comes from pipes that aren't made of lead, that you have toilets that aren't shared with strangers, that your garbage is collected rather than accumulating in streets, that modern medicine can prevent or cure diseases that killed Romans by the thousands, and that walking city streets after dark is uncomfortable at worst, rather than a likely death sentence. Appreciate that the material conditions of modern urban life represent escape from dangers that ancient Romans simply accepted as inevitable. And remember that the glory of Rome wasn't glorious for the ordinary people who lived and died in its shadow. Sweet dreams.